Welcome back to part 2 on our lesson about wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone National Park. I hope you enjoyed watching the video of the wolves. One of the things that always comes to mind whenever I watch that video is I think about all the time we spent earlier this year talking about erosion, weathering, and deposition, and how we've talked about that there can be factors like the current of a river that can pick up sediments and move and dump them to other places. So when I look at that video, I just think about the amazing power and interconnection between all organisms within an ecosystem. We know that plants and tree roots help to secure soils so that they don't have as much movement or erosion in the ecosystem. So to think that the reintroduction of just a few wolves under 20 can have such an impact that it can change the movement of the rivers, to me is just amazing. So let's take a look at some of the data that scientists have collected about species in Yellowstone National Park. Now, one of the important species that they're studying is the plants and trees because of its impact on erosion and deposition and the changing of the landscape. So we're going to look at some graphs in the next few sections. This information is a study that started in 2012 that looked at the trophic cascade in the Yellowstone National Park. Specifically, the scientists focused on aspen, willow, and cottonwoods, which happen to be common food for browsers or consumers like the elk. Willows are also commonly eaten by beavers. So scientists wanted to measure these trees and shrubs to look at the impact that the browsers or those consumers had on their growth. So they looked at 3 different factors of the tree to help them gather information. They looked at tree height, which is a measurement about how tall the tree can grow. They took a look at something called tree recruitment, and recruitment is the growth of seedlings or sprouts, so younger trees that are able to grow above the level or the height of the browser. So in other words, the tree is able to grow taller than the level at which an elk or beaver or other browsers can eat them. Finally, they might look at tree rings, which help to indicate the age of a tree. The more rings that a tree has, the older that it is. So as there are increases in these 3 measurements, we can have an indication of an increase in the level of health of those plants. Now, when these measurements decrease, this could indicate that there's a higher level of browsing or consumer organisms or species that is put on the plant. So therefore, we see that they are not able to be successful in living. So I'm going to start with taking a look at elk versus the wolf, and then we'll take a look at the beaver versus some of those plants. Now, you might notice by looking at our graph that the elk population is indicated in thousands. So as I'm looking over here, I can see population in thousand. And looking at the year going across, our information starts in about 1993. Now, if I go over to the wolf population during that same time, I notice that the population is not measured in thousands, but in nearly single organisms. So looking at that 1993, I see that there are 0 wolves that are living in Yellowstone National Park. Now, in the year 1995, this is when scientists reintroduced a few wolves, and looking at my population, the number is around 20, into the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park. Now, as the years go on, we start to steadily see an increase in the wolf population. You might notice that in a few years there are dips, looking at what looks to be around 1999, 2000, as well as 2005. But for the most part, we can look at the wolf population and see that it is increasing minus these few dips. At the same time, taking a look at the elk population, we see that it is decreasing. Now, this is an important piece of information to think about because in a few minutes we're also going to be looking at tree populations. So remember that as the wolf population is increasing and as the wolf is reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, we see at the same time the elk population is going down. Why might that be? Well, because the elk is a food source for the wolf. So as the wolves are in Yellowstone National Park, they are consuming the elk, causing the population to decrease. Now, you may have noticed there's a dip in the wolf population in 2005 and 2010. Those years, there were some viruses that were introduced, not on purpose, but just as we know, viruses get introduced and illnesses get introduced into populations. The wolves that were not strong enough to be able to fight off these populations did die. So we can attribute those dips to illnesses within the population. Well, how do scientists know that? Well, scientists have tagged all the wolves in Yellowstone National Park, and so they are able to track their movement, as well as if they are to pass away, they're able to locate their bodies, and at that point in time, they're able to do some testing and some research to find out what might have happened to that organism. Most of the wolves outside of these few dips that are viruses that we find in Yellowstone National Park do die of natural causes. A few also have died because of auto accidents and been hit by people who are in Yellowstone National Park. Now, if I want to take a look at, and I see here that instead of plant, I have plain population, elk versus the plant populations. I can see that as the elk populations are going downward, the plant populations are going upward. Now remember, one of the benefits of reintroducing plants into our ecosystems is that they allow for the stabilization of soils, so less movements of sediments, which has an impact on the rivers and their flows. Now, if we think about the river and their flow and their ability to cut through an area, it has a very large impact over many years. Now, another graph that you are going to see today is going to take a look at beavers versus the plants. So it's good to be aware that these cottonwoods and aspens and willow trees have an increase of life as we see a decrease in the elk population. Now you'll notice when you look at the willow tree and the aspen that there is more than one line in the graph, and that is to account for they looked at multiple species of those plants within those populations. Now, today for your exit ticket, you are going to be asked to examine some data at Yellowstone National Park. So after this video, you'll go ahead and click on the link, and you are going to bring up a document called Examining Data at Yellowstone National Park. As in our previous documents, we're going to ask you to fill out your first name, your last name, your science teacher. And then what you are going to find is that there are going to be some of the pieces of data that we looked at earlier. So first there will be the elk population versus the wolf population. And there are two questions about that. There's a question underneath each of the pieces of data. So you can look at the elk versus the wolf and just trying to look for some trends. What kinds of things do we notice happens to the populations over time? As well as does looking at a graph allow scientists to know when a new organism is reintroduced into an ecosystem? In this case, we intentionally reintroduced the wolf. But what if another organism just wandered into another area? Would scientists be able to tell based on the number of species within there? Then, after you've looked a little bit closer at the elk and wolf population, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and take a look at beaver colonies versus trees. Now, hopefully, you had a chance to watch the video before this, and so you learned a little bit more about the beaver colonies and how there was an increase in the beavers in Yellowstone National Park due to the increase of wolf introduction. So there are a few follow-up questions about the beavers, as well as looking at relationships between those as well. Okay? So go ahead, take a look at these questions. There are 4 questions. A lot of them are asking you to examine the graph, so give those your best go, and then we'll take a look at your answers when you submit it to us.